Being the spare son was a role I never asked for, but one my family assigned me without hesitation. My older brother Daniel was the golden child strata student, star athlete, charming in every way they adored. Meanwhile, I was the afterthought. At birthdays, his cakes were elaborate and celebrated with big parties. Mine, forgotten 3 years in a row, with my mom scrambling afterward saying, "Oh, we'll do something next weekend," but that weekend never came. It wasn't just the birthdays. It was the way my opinions at family gatherings were brushed aside. How my accomplishments were met with silence while Daniel's smallest wins were applauded like Olympic victories. I learned early on that in my family's eyes, I wasn't the son who mattered. I was the one who filled space. Then came Uncle Cornelius. He wasn't like the rest of them. Gruff, eccentric man, he owned a sprawling 47 acres of land on the edge of town. When I was a kid, he'd let me follow him around while he worked, telling stories about the land's history, about how people forget that real wealth isn't shiny or loud, it's what lasts. While everyone else ignored me, he gave me a kind of quiet respect. I didn't realize then just how much that would mean later. When Cornelius passed, my family assumed Daniel would inherit everything. At the will reading, I sat in the corner like usual, watching Daniel and my parents whisper excitedly, certain they were about to secure the land that had been in Cornelius's care for decades. But then the lawyer cleared his throat and read Cornelius's final wishes. I, Cornelius M. Graves, leave the entirety of my property, 47 acres of land, to my great-nephew. The room held its breath. To John. My name in his will. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's jaw dropped. My mother's face twisted as though she'd tasted something sour. My father muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if there had been some mistake. But there was no mistake. Every line of the document was clear, every signature legal. The land was mine. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I wasn't the spare. I wasn't the forgotten son. I was the one holding the cards. The irony wasn't lost on me. Same family that hadn't remembered my birthday for 3 years straight suddenly seemed to remember everything about me. Their eyes shifted quickly, calculating, already plotting how they might convince me to part with what had just been placed in my hands. I left the lawyer's office with the deed in my pocket and a storm brewing behind me. For once, I had something they couldn't ignore, and I could already feel the shift in their energy. What I didn't realize yet was just how far they'd go to try to claim what was never theirs to begin with. It started almost immediately after the will reading. By the time I got home that evening, my phone was buzzing with more messages than I'd ever received from my family in an entire year. My mom texted, "We should do a family dinner soon. It's been too long." My dad called, leaving a voicemail about wanting to catch up like old times. Even Daniel, who usually only reached out if he needed something, sent me a cheerful, "Hey man, let's grab a beer this week." I almost laughed. These were the same people who couldn't remember to wish me happy birthday, who skipped my college graduation because Daniel's company's softball game had gone into extra innings. And now I was suddenly worth their time. I decided to play along, just to see how far they'd go. At dinner the following weekend, they rolled out the red carpet tour, at least, their version of it. My mom cooked my favorite meal, something she hadn't done since I was a teenager. My dad kept patting me on the back, smiling like he was proud of me. Daniel sat across from me, trying too hard to act casual, asking about work, my hobbies, even if I was dating anyone. The whole evening was drenched in forced warmth, like they were trying to smother me with the kind of love they had withheld for years, but I could see it in their eyes. The way their smiles twitched when they talked about family traditions and staying connected. The way the conversation kept circling back to Uncle Cornelius, to the land, to how much responsibility it must be to manage it all alone. "You know," my mom said sweetly, "your brother has such a good head for business. Maybe you two could work together on this land thing. Keep it in the family." My dad chimed in, nodding. "It's a lot of work, son. You shouldn't have to handle it all yourself. We could help. That's what family's for." Daniel leaned forward with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "I mean, technically, you don't even really need the land, right? You live in the city, you're busy. Wouldn't it be easier to let someone else handle it for you?" I sipped my drink and smiled politely, pretending not to notice the way they were circling me like vultures. Inside, though, I was taking notes. Every line, every suggestion, every attempt to nudge me toward the outcome they wanted. For years, I had been invisible to them. Suddenly, I was the center of their universe, but only because I held something they couldn't buy, something they couldn't bully out of me. As I drove home that night, their voices still ringing in my ears, I realized something important. They weren't just trying to win me over. They were desperate. Desperate enough to lie, manipulate, and grovel. If it meant getting their hands on those 47 acres. And the more desperate they became, the clearer it was. My next move had to be careful, deliberate, and if I played it right, absolutely devastating. It didn't take long for the polite smiles and we love you dinners to turn into full-blown campaigns. Within a week, my parents organized what they called a family meeting. Normally, those meetings were reserved for things like planning holidays or deciding who was bringing what dish to Thanksgiving. But now, it was about my land. I sat at the dining room table, the same one where I'd eaten countless meals in silence while Daniel basked in praise. This time, though, everyone's eyes were on me. My mom opened with a syrupy smile, folding her hands. "Sweetheart, we've been thinking a lot about your inheritance. 47 acres is a lot. It's such a big responsibility. We just want to make sure you're not overwhelmed." My dad leaned forward, nodding. "Exactly. You've got your own life, your job. You don't want this weighing you down. That's where family comes in. We can help shoulder the load." Then Daniel pulled out a folder, yes, a literal folder filled with printouts and diagrams. "Look," he said, spreading them across the table. "I did some research. That land could be developed into something huge, housing, maybe even a commercial project. We'd all benefit if we worked together." I raised an eyebrow. "By we, you mean me and you?" He chuckled, waving his hand like I was being ridiculous. "Come on, man, you know I've always been good with numbers. You don't even live out there. It makes sense for me to manage it. You'd still get cut." The way he said it made my skin crawl, like he was doing me a favor by slicing off a piece of something that was already mine. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around the table. My mom was nodding eagerly. My dad tapping the table like this was a done deal. None of them were asking what I wanted. None of them had even considered that maybe, just maybe, Uncle Cornelius had given me the land for a reason. "Interesting idea," I said finally, keeping my tone neutral. "But I'm not making any decisions right now. Still new, and I want to think about it." My mom's smile wavered. "Of course, darling, take your time. We just want what's best for you." But I could see the disappointment in their faces. They weren't expecting resistance. They thought I'd roll over like always, hand them the prize they thought was theirs by default. When I left that night, Daniel followed me out to the driveway. He leaned against my car, lowering his voice. "Listen, John, don't be stupid about this. You don't know what to do with that land, but I do. If you try to keep it out of pride, you'll regret it." For years, I'd swallowed comments like that, but this time, I looked him in the eye and smiled. "We'll see." As I drove away, my hands tightened on the wheel. They were circling, pressuring, and scheming, but none of them realized I'd already had a plan forming, and it wasn't going to look anything like the future they were imagining. After the meeting, I spent the next few days walking the 47 acres my great-uncle had left me. It wasn't just land, it was history. Its old stone walls, hidden groves of oak and maple, a creek that had carved its way across the property for generations. Cornelius had loved this place, and it had always been more than just soil and trees. It was a legacy. While my family spent dinners trying to guilt me, I made mental maps. Trails I wanted to preserve. Fields I wanted to open for the community. The old barn that could be restored rather than torn down for profit. Every plan was carefully crafted, not just to honor my uncle, but to show my family that their schemes wouldn't dictate the outcome. I knew they were waiting for a signal, waiting for me to give in, to let greed guide my decisions the way it guided theirs. But I had no intention of letting that happen. I wanted the land to flourish and for them to watch as their expectations crumbled. My parents didn't call for a few days after the meeting, probably surprised by my silence. But Daniel wasn't patient. He sent text after text. "Let's meet and discuss the land. Don't make a hasty decision. You're being unreasonable." I read each one, smiled, and then deleted it. I even started visiting the local town hall, checking zoning laws and speaking with planners about how I could make the land sustainable. Cornelius had always cared about conservation and community. I intended to carry that forward. And the more I learned, the more I realized that the family's idea of developing the land was a direct contradiction to everything my great-uncle had valued. At the next family dinner, they tried the old tactic again. My mom smiled sweetly and said, "We just want to help you maximize the land. You know how your Uncle Wazi would have wanted it used wisely?" I nodded politely. "I'm thinking about several projects," I said. "Some trails for the community, some land restoration, even a small educational area for local students. Cornelius always believed in giving back, so that's what I plan to do." Daniel's face twisted. "Community projects. That's not how you make money. You're wasting potential." I kept my tone calm, almost friendly. "I think honoring Uncle Cornelius is more important than profit." The silence that followed was delicious. They had expected hesitation, uncertainty, maybe a chance to steer me toward their plans. Instead, I'd laid down a future they couldn't touch, and the shock on their faces told me everything I needed to know. For the first time, I felt a sense of ownership, not just of the land, but of my life. I wasn't the overlooked son anymore. I wasn't the one being ignored or manipulated. As I left that dinner, I knew the best part was still to come. The moment when they realized that the land and the power it represented was finally beyond their reach. A few weeks later, the pressure ramped up. My family stopped hiding their intentions, and the polite dinners turned into pointed conversations and veiled threats. At one gathering, my mother sat across from me, her hands folded, voice dripping with faux concern. "John, it's a lot of work. You're still so young. Wouldn't it make sense to sell some of the land? You could make a fortune." Daniel jumped in immediately. "Yeah, or at least let me manage the development. You live in the city, you don't even use the property. It's wasted on you." My father nodded along. "You have a career. You can't split your time between your job and managing the land. I'm just trying to help." I stayed calm, letting them spill their frustration. Inside, I was smiling. They had finally shown their true colors, and it was satisfying to watch the desperation creep into their expressions. Finally, I spoke. "I've made a decision." The room froze. My mother's eyes widened. Daniel leaned forward, bracing for the usual hesitation. My father straightened, sensing the gravity in my tone. "I'm donating half of the land to the local community center," I said. "We'll develop walking trails, a small educational farm, and a public green space. The other half will remain a private nature preserve under my care, ensuring it stays exactly the way Uncle Cornelius wanted it." The reaction was instantaneous. My mother's lips trembled. Daniel's face turned red, his jaw tightening so hard I thought it might crack. My father's hands fell to the table, shaking slightly as he processed what I had just said. "You? What?" Daniel finally managed, his voice sharp with disbelief. "You're giving it away." "Not giving it away," I corrected gently. "I'm putting it to good use. Something lasting, something meaningful, something none of us can exploit for money." My parents started stammering, trying to frame it as wasteful or naive. "But John, think about your future. You could retire early if you sold it." I smiled, the kind of calm, certain smile I'd never had before. "I don't measure success in profit. Cornelius left this land to me for a reason, and I intend to honor that." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "You're throwing away our legacy. This land is part of the family's heritage." I leaned back, letting the words sink in. "No, it's part of Uncle Cornelius's heritage, not yours. And he trusted me with it, not you." The stunned silence that followed was intoxicating. For the first time, the family that had ignored me for decades was speechless. They had expected me to cave, to hand over the property or sell it for cash. Instead, I had taken control, making a choice they couldn't influence or undo. And in that moment, I felt more alive and powerful than I ever had in my life. I wasn't just the spare son anymore. I was the one with the vision, the authority, and the clarity to shape the future of the land exactly as it should be. The weeks after my announcement were strangely peaceful. My family's attempts to manipulate or guilt me into changing my mind faded, replaced by awkward silence at gatherings and tentative messages that went unanswered. I had never experienced anything like it. For decades, I had lived in the shadow of Daniel, ignored and underestimated, and now, suddenly, I held the power they had always assumed I'd never possess. At first, they tried subtle maneuvers, casual comments at dinner, veiled hints about responsibility and family tradition. but I didn't react. I let them talk, smile politely, and continue to reveal their own frustration. Every word, every twitch, only confirmed how thoroughly my decision had shaken them. I spent weekends walking the land, planning the community projects, and restoring the old barn that had been falling into ruin. Volunteers from the town came to help once they learned of my intentions. Local kids started visiting, curious about the nature trails and educational farm plots. With each step forward, I realized that the land had become more than just inheritance. It was now a legacy I was actively building, one that honored Uncle Cornelius and my own sense of purpose. Occasionally, I would receive a text from my parents, short and polite, thanking me for inviting them to events or asking questions about the farm. Daniel tried to offer his expertise again, but I declined. It wasn't out of spite. It was about boundaries. They had ignored me for years. Now, I had the right to shape this life on my own terms. One evening, I sat on the edge of the creek, watching the sunlight glitter on the water, and I reflected on the transformation. The boy who had been overlooked, forgotten, and treated like a spare son had grown into someone who could make real, impactful choices. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was grateful. Grateful that Cornelius had trusted me. Grateful that I had resisted their pressure. And grateful that I could finally claim the respect and autonomy that had always been denied to me. My family eventually came to accept the new reality, though it took months. There were grudging acknowledgments, moments of admiration disguised as concern, and subtle signs that they understood they could no longer manipulate the land or me. That understanding was perhaps more satisfying than any applause or praise. Standing on the highest hill of the property, looking down at the fields, forests, and winding creek, I realized something important. Wealth isn't always about money. Sometimes it's about control, choice, and the courage to do what's right, Evan, when everyone else expects you to yield. The land wasn't just a piece of inheritance anymore. It was a symbol of my growth, my independence, and that was a victory no one could ever take away.